for the Institute for European Policymaking at Bocconi, which for all of you who are not familiar yet with the Institute, is a think tank founded by Mario Monti. And the idea is to create a bridge between academic research and actual policy making. So the topic of today's seminar is perfectly in that line, and we will discuss about lobbying in at the European Union level, how corporations shape EU policies in an electoral year. The core of this webinar will be Nilanjana Nell Dutt's work. She has been working with her co-authors on a very interesting project which try to answer this question. Does lobbying work? What do lobby want to achieve? What is their outcome? How can we measure that at European level? She has very interesting data, very interesting analysis, and she will share these preliminary results with us. Catherine, I have introduced Nell properly. She's a YEP fellow, and but mainly she's an associate professor of strategy at Bocconi University in the Department of Management and Technology. Catherine de Vries, she's a professor she's a fellow, she's a member of the YEP, and she's also a member of the YEP Management Board, and she's also a Dean for International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at Bocconi, and she will chair the discussion. Before giving the floor to Catherine, I have to introduce Ernesto Di Giovanni. He's an actual lobbyist, so he will share with us how lobbyists think, what they do. And we invited him because he's a partner of Utopia, which is one of the major Italian lobbying firms, with offices in Rome, in Milan, and in Brussels. So he is one of the kind of lobbyist that Nell covered in her project. Then Alberto Alemanno will join us in the second part of the meeting because he had an inconvenience, he has a problem. Alberto is a Jean Monnet professor in European Union law at HEC in Paris, but he's most known for being an activist, a public intellectual with his project called The Good Lobby, which is a volunteer-based nonprofit focused on fostering the role of good lobbying in the public debate and how to make decisions more transparent and more understandable by voters. So with no further ado, I give the floor to Catherine. I just have to remember you that this meeting is on the record, and then you can subscribe to the YEP newsletter. You will find the link in the chat, so you can be informed of our next events. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefano. So my name is Catherine de Vries. I'm very happy to be here and to moderate this session. Just for all of you who are attending, so the kind of flow of the meeting is that Nell will present, I'm going to go by first names because we just had the formal introduction, that Nell is going to present her research about 15 minutes. I guess questions might arise already when she's presenting, so please use the chat to highlight your questions, and then after Nell has presented, I will try to see if some of the questions have arisen and ask them to Nell, but then hand over to Ernesto already for some of his thoughts about Nell's presentation. And when Alberto joins, Alberto will give his perspective as well. After we've heard Nell and the panelists, we will then open the floor for some Q&A, but please feel free to already add them in the chat. With no further ado, Nell, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Let me know if you have trouble hearing me or with the slides. And thank you, Stefano, so much for the introduction, as well as organizing this wonderful panel. Ernesto, I will definitely be following up with you soon for meetings to learn more about how lobbying really works. As you'll see, we have a theory, but the question is, does it work in practice? So with no further ado, this is a project that is part of a longer term interest of mine, along with my co-authors, Miguel and Johan, who are also at Bocconi University, Eli Sung, who is actually a colleague of Alberto Alemanno's at HEC Paris, and we've actually already chatted with him about our project, and Ruyu Lee, who was a master's student at Bocconi and now is a PhD student at Boston University. And I should also add that this project is a winner of a Cariplo Foundation grant. We haven't started getting the money yet, which is why you don't see their logo on the slides. But hopefully the next time I present, you will see their logo and you'll also see a full working paper. So I don't have to give this audience too much of an introduction to the topic. In particular, I really look forward to learning more about the topic from the experts in the room. But just to sort of set the stage, our specific question in this first paper from our project is to understand whether lobbying leads to more EU public procurement contracts. And as we know, lobbying is important. It's something that firms do, but it's been very difficult to sort of identify the payoffs for firms from lobbying. And so for those of you that might run away before my presentation because it's too boring, I just want to give you a sense of what our main findings are. So the takeaway is that yes, we find across different models that one additional meeting leads to a 1.5 to 3% increase in the number of contracts per firm. And if you look at the contract value, that increase is much larger. These gains, however, seem to arise mostly for firms that are based in the EU that have prior ties to UK commissioners. This is partly a function of our empirical design, but I'll talk about what it might mean more broadly. And I also look forward to hearing from Ernesto and Catherine regarding what they think. And our contributions here, of course, are to understand more about corporate lobbying in the EU, but also try and identify some sorts of tangible returns that firms might experience from lobbying. Now, to set the stage, here's sort of what the distribution of lobbying meetings looks like in our sample. So we look at meetings only between firms. We don't look at NGOs or other types of organizations, and EU regulators. So that is members of the EU Commission, the commissioners themselves, as well as their staff, as well as members of parliament. And what you will see is that there is a consistent and substantial increase in the number of meetings over the course of our sample. Interestingly, not even COVID really slowed this down because regulators actually moved to having meetings online. So this was an interesting innovation on their part, much like universities did. But what it suggests is that both in terms of the supply and demand, lobbying continued to grow. So, as a phenomenon, there's growing evidence of lobbying in the EU. In our sample, which comprises all the publicly listed firms in the EU from 2016 to 2022, 6% of firms engage in meetings. Now, this is not a huge number. The US, this would be closer to 10% based on a paper that was actually published about 10 years ago, so maybe even more than that now. But what is important, as I showed in the graph, is that the trend suggests this is an activity that's increasing more and more, and we don't understand a whole lot about how this helps firms, whether this helps firms, and its consequences more broadly for politics in the EU. And so that's the motivation behind us getting into this project. Our understanding of lobbying is that this is an opportunity for both firms and regulators to exchange information. And in this process of exchanging information, firms might gain some insights that help them improve their likelihood of winning contracts. The contracts that we focus on are very consequential. So these are contracts that are part of the Tenders Electronic Daily database. So these are all contracts that have to be above a threshold value. And that depends a little bit on what public works sector we look at. But the lowest cutoff is over 140,000 euro. So again, these are not small contracts of 10,000, 20,000 euro. These are large contracts. They make a substantial difference to the financial performance of firms. In our sample of 7 years, we see about almost 1,400 contracts being awarded with an average annual value of 26.7 million. So there's a lot of money at stake. And so you can see why understanding the extent to which lobbying affects this likelihood of success is important. From an academic perspective as well, lobbying in the EU is very interesting. Why is that? We have a very clear delineation in the EU between the institutional pathway of interacting with regulators via the Commission and the political pathway of interacting with regulators via the Parliament. And this is something that we're not fully exploiting in this paper, but is something we would like to understand better in terms of the trade-offs firms make in lobbying one aspect, the institutional versus the political. Secondly, we are amongst the first papers that can actually measure interactions. A lot of the earlier research on lobbying assumes that meetings are occurring because a member of parliament might be on the board of a firm. On the other hand, with the meetings database being publicly available, we can actually ensure that an interaction has occurred between a firm and a regulator, and in turn, information was exchanged. And again, our argument is that through this information exchange, firms might learn some things which help them secure contracts better. And moreover, because a lot of the lobbying in the EU is in-house, so most of the large firms in our sample have in-house lobbying facilities, we would expect that firms are making this investment because they will experience some sort of a return. However, it's very hard to come up with an estimate of how big that return should be. So we're quite open about, the size of the effect that we might find. Oops, wrong direction. Lastly, from a theoretical point of view, another thing that strongly affects information seeking in general is uncertainty. We would expect that if firms face an unexpected rise in uncertainty, either political or regulatory, they might be more likely to engage in lobbying as a way to resolve that uncertainty. Or if that uncertainty is too high, they might actually want to wait until they seek more information. In either case, uncertainty can serve as an independent trigger to lobbying outside of firms' preferences for meeting EU regulators. And this is going to be an important piece in our empirical design of trying to isolate the effective meetings on contracts. So that's it for the theory. I'm going to get to the interesting part, which is the data set and our results. So we have a panel data set from 2016 to 2022, comprising several data sources. We started by first identifying all the publicly listed firms in the EU using the Bureau van Dijk's Orbis dataset. We then combined this with the Tenders Electronic Daily dataset, which tracks all large contracts that are put out for public bidding by the EU. And then we matched this with all the firms whose names show up in the meetings database, which is a database where all EU regulators need to disclose whichever organizations they have meetings with. As you might imagine, matching the names was not easy because there's human error in when the names are entered. And so we spent a lot of time using various fuzzy matching techniques, but ultimately with the help of some computer scientists here at Bocconi, we were able to get a fairly clean data set, which tracks 11,000 firms over the 7 years, of which 6% lobby and only 3% win contracts. So again, these numbers are not very large in terms of the extensiveness of lobbying within the sample. But then again, if we do find an effect, that's even more meaningful. What I will say is that our sample comprises all types of firms. So we have firms that don't lobby and don't win contracts. We have firms that do lobby and don't win contracts. We have firms that don't lobby and do win contracts. And then, of course, firms that both lobby and win contracts. And our goal will be to identify to what extent does lobbying actually predict your likelihood of winning contracts. So a quick overview of the most basic results, where we simply look at the correlation between having a meeting and winning a contract, finds that depending on whether you have a meeting with the EU Commission or a member of Parliament, your likelihood of winning a contract is positively increased by 1.5 to 3%. These models control for a variety of firm-specific features, such as the operating revenue, the income, various measures of size and performance. Essentially, we would think bigger firms, more successful firms, are going to be more likely to win contracts anyway. Hence, we try and control for these factors. In addition, there's a number of things specific to each firm, specific to each year, specific to the industry that might also affect the likelihood of winning a contract. So we control for these factors. But as Stefano pointed out the very first time I told him about this project, firms are choosing to lobby. And thus it could simply be the firms that are good at lobbying engage in lobbying activities, And this is what's ultimately predicting their likelihood of winning contracts, not so much the meetings themselves. This is where we turn to Brexit, which for once has been helpful in allowing researchers to exploit some unexpected regulatory uncertainty. So Brexit was widely understood to be a very unexpected event, and it created a great deal of uncertainty regarding both how EU firms would trade in the UK and with UK firms, and even more so how UK firms would continue their operations in the EU and trade with other EU firms. And what we see is that, indeed, in the light of this uncertainty, all firms reduce their meetings with both EU and UK regulators to some extent. But the UK firms did not statistically significantly reduce their meetings with EU commissioners. They did with UK commissioners, but not with EU commissioners, because their need for additional information about how to resolve this uncertainty was substantially higher than it was for EU firms. So to help us kind of get a sense of the scale of the effect, I'm just going to show you simple numbers describing the change in the number of meetings. These results are consistent with more complete regression analyses with several other controls, but in the interest of time, I'm trying to keep it simple. So before Brexit happened, in the 6 months leading to Brexit, on average, EU-based firms had 61 meetings per month with any type of regulator, and for UK firms, that number was 10. Now, our sample has many more EU firms, so we shouldn't be too surprised that the number of meetings for EU firms is a lot more. But this is the distribution before Brexit happened. After Brexit, the meetings with UK commissioners substantially fall. For EU firms, it's 0.3 meetings per month. For UK firms, it's 0.27. And both of these changes are statistically significantly different. So there's a strong reduction. However, when it comes to meetings with EU regulators, for the EU firms, that continues to fall to about 40 meetings per month. And this 40 is significantly different from 61. But for the UK firms, the meetings with EU commissioners drops on average to 7 a month. And this 7 is not different from the 10. So in general, there's a reduction in meetings, there's a reduction in willingness to invest in getting information in this period of high uncertainty, but substantially less so by the UK firms than the EU firms. Now, the next question is, what does this mean in terms of contracts? I mean, that is the outcome that we care most about. What the Brexit research design allows us to do is to identify the changes in meetings that occur as a result of this unexpected change in regulatory uncertainty, rather than preferences on the part of the firm. And so given that we have this somewhat independent change in the number of meetings, what does this do to contracts? We see in general that contracts increase for all firms across the board, but the benefits are actually higher for EU-based firms. So again, in terms of numbers, before Brexit, an average EU-based firms were getting 6.2 contracts per month. For the UK-based firms, it was 1 contract per month. After Brexit, for the EU firms, they got almost 4 times as many contracts, so 23. For the UK firms, it was about 3.5. And then in terms of value, the EU firms had a 6,000% increase in value, whereas for UK firms, there was still an increase, but it was statistically significantly lower. So putting this all together, we see that lobbying is positively correlated with contracts, and there are much bigger benefits for EU firms. In the next steps of our analysis, what we want to do is see if this varies by additional firm and industry-specific features, such as the amount of experience the firm has in lobbying, whether the firms are in regulated or less regulated industries to understand the extent of interaction with regulators. And again, are they in industries with intangible assets, which we know, such as technology industries, are growing much more quickly than industries with tangible assets. Second, what can also matter is the experience of the regulator. So does it matter if you meet a commissioner versus a director general? And then, of course, I hope after today we'll have a host of other alternative explanations for our results, which we can try and test for as well. So to summarize, lobbying is associated with the 1.5 to 3% increase in getting contracts across different models. Given that the meetings that drive these increases are a conduit for exchanging information, that's not necessarily specific to contracts. The size of the effect is surprising, and this stays stable across the different types of analyses we've done. Interestingly, we see that the UK firms in our sample tend to lobby relatively more, but don't see as strong of an increase in terms of contracts. So some questions that come to mind are, is this suggesting that some lobbying is very beneficial, but additional lobbying isn't, or does this have something specific to do with Brexit and our research design? I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. Thank you very much. And let me know if I should stop sharing or if I should just leave the slides up.
I'm happy to do either now, but maybe for the audience, we can just stop sharing for now and then add to it. So before I hand over also to Ernesto some comments, I just wanted to give you also a little bit of a feedback of my area of expertise is EU policymaking. And I think the first things that you said in the conclusion would be very important to think about, because what we know if we look at lobbying in the European Union, that it's lobbying in particular areas, and Ernesto can also talk probably to that. So in EU speak, you often talk about where the EU has competence on, which is a very German translation, but the extent to which the EU just does certain things and doesn't do other things, right? So as you were referring to, there's in the period that maybe you're looking at, you're going to see quite a lot of tech lobby because there's a lot of digital regulation that's on the horizon, or environmental lobby because we're going to think, or agricultural lobby because we're seeing kind of a Green Deal, or trade lobby when it comes to those British firms, when it comes to a trade deal, when it comes to the European Union. So I think these sectoral aspects that you were referring to would be very interesting to think about, especially also to get a bit of a sense of, is this a Brexit effect or is this a particular aspect of that? But the other aspect, I think, which is also very interesting, is then who do you lobby, right? So it would be very interesting to see just a kind of element as to, certain commissioners also, which I don't want to, I don't want to, sorry, someone came into my room. I didn't want to kind of cause any offense to any particular commissioner, but some commissioners are perceived as not necessarily having portfolios that we think are really crucial, which comes back to this regulatory power. So one thing that I also thought about when you were presenting your results about less interactions, for example, with the British commissioner, well, particularly the last commissioner, King, was doing security-related issues, which maybe now, right, would be a really important aspect, but at that time was not necessarily the major area that the European Union, in the period that you're looking at, right? So, of course, post-Ukraine war, and you can think about defense firms, and you can think about like a lot of things happening there, but it maybe was not necessarily always an issue that a lot of lobbying firms were thinking about. And then I think the last, so those were kind of 2 points. And I think the last thing that I would be interested in, but that's maybe more, and also maybe Ernesto has something to say about that, and later on Alberto, is it would also be very interesting to think, like, well, you're looking here at what interest groups are doing in terms of their contracting. But what I thought would be also very interesting is, to what extent do we think that some of these lobbying activities have actually an effect on the type of regulations we're seeing in certain areas when it comes to the European Union? Let's say tech, of course, when we have, and that comes very much of this idea that of Bradford and others, that the EU, among many other things, is kind of what she calls a Brussels effect, is kind of a regulator for the world. So the extent to which, the EU firms or UK firms have an effect on actual regulation might be really important. So just to summarize, I think one is this, just to encourage you to do this kind of setup by different regulatory sectors, let's say, or policy sectors, because of the difference, then thinking a bit about different commissioners and their DGs in terms of how important they are. And then thirdly, I think will be really interesting to think about, to what extent do these meetings not only pay off, let's say, for firms, but also might pay off for them in a different way by actually affecting the regulation that you see happening at the European level. But those are just some thoughts. Maybe you want to respond very quickly. And then I asked hand over to Ernesto, who's much more an expert than I am on this particular aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are great thoughts. We certainly will do the industry variation. I think the last point you made about, and for the UK specific commissioners, certainly this is something we can look at. This is what we'll do with the experience measures. But the last point is the most important one. So, I think what we all care about is how this affects long-term regulation. One of the things we've struggled with is how to measure that. So I'll be happy to chat with you offline. But as I said, this is a long-term project. If you have suggestions on how we can track this, we're on board. That's the most important thing to try and understand better. Yeah.
Perfect. As a fellow political scientist some years ago, wrote a book on it. I'm going to put it in the chat.
Excellent.
Some ways to think about it. But that's beyond two academics. I think we want to kind of broaden it up. And
yes.
And I will give the floor to Ernesto Giovanni, who indeed, as Stefano said at the beginning, has a lot of active insight into this area. So the floor is yours, Ernesto.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much, Andrea, for your presentation, and Stefano for inviting me this conference. And I really liked very much the research that has been explained right now, and the results that I read are particularly clear and in line of what we are doing in our activity in Brussels.
Okay,
let me just explain what we really do. Utopia, as Stefano said, is a lobbying agency, lobbying advocacy agency that is, it's based in Rome. We have offices in Rome, in Milan, and in Brussels. We opened our offices in Brussels 5 years ago, before after the European elections of 2019, just a few months before the COVID arrived. And so it was pretty hard for us to be in Brussels in that period. But I guess we learned very much about what we think about lobbying activity in Brussels. Right now we have an office of 12 people working in our office, mostly people coming from all around Europe. So they're not just an Italian agency, but it's a European agency, just because we have to manage our activity not just with the Italian delegation. It's a point which I will arrive to explain, but with the delegation of all the key member states in Europe. Let's start from one point. Lobbying is mostly about a human factor. When we were talking about the different experience of the commissioners and their ability to learn and to listen to the requests coming from the trade association or from industries, mostly it's about human factor. It's about the perspective that a commissioner or MPs has to understand and to learn and to listen the positions and the instances coming from industries or from associations or from the grassroots lobbying that are coming also from key member states. And Europe is the most regulated market in the world. We can't say without any kind of doubts, it's the most regulated market in the world. And it's one of the richest one. The 2022 the product of Europe was over $14 trillion. So it's one of the huge market in the world. So why is the reason why a lot of industries are in Europe and the lobbying in Europe, not just for a trade association coming from the key member states, but we have corporations coming from all over the world that are lobbying in our continent. And also Europe as one of the most transparency and regular-based lobbying regulation in the world, because it allows access to the people and to the places to lobbyists that are registered in the public book in the European Parliament. We have rules that we have to respect about the contracts that we have with our clients, that we have to follow. For example, the clients that we are following, the amount of money they're giving us to our contracts, the objectives of our contracts, so why we are engaging MPs or why we are engaging people coming from the commissions about which kind of issues. So this allows Europe to have a huge market of lobbying activities. But it depends also on the lobbying maturity of corporations. Most of them, the biggest one, have inside, professionals that are doing lobbying. So I'm referring to the best, the most important multinational in the world. There is inside offices of 10, 20, 30 people working on regulatory and government affairs in Brussels and abroad the countries. And this is about lobbying maturity. They can process informations, they can process policies that are coming from EU, and so they can shape all the activity all around Europe, basically starting from Brussels. Also, the cooperation that we are working on here in Italy, they have a higher level of representative in Brussels that manage all the countries. Because all the activities and the lobby activities that we are doing also in Italy, most of them depends on Brussels. As Catherine was saying, the competences is the most important basic of verticals that we are following also here in Italy to understand which kind of policy we have to follow at the EU policies. And for sure, tech, digital, environment, energy, agriculture, also security and defense are right now the most, and trade association, and then it's also manufacturers are the most important industries we are focusing on, we are working on in Brussels, because those are competences coming from a EU perspective, a EU legislation that is coming in the other member states. And for sure, as your research is showing, the activity in EU, the lobbying activity is improving, and it's going to be more and more and more in the next years. Hi, Alberto. And especially in this period, because we have the European elections in June, and we don't know what is coming after. We will have an opinion, or we can think what is going to happen after the election, but nobody knows how will be the new commissions, which kind of MPs you will have in the next legislature. Which would be the dossier or the issues on which the Commission will make the work on these years. Maybe we could have a shift between what this Commission has done in the last 5 years, because also the things that happened around the world, the various crises, the Ukraine one, the Israeli, or whatever, changed a lot of the issues and the policies of the European Commission during the legislature, because we started in 2019 with the Green Deal Act that was made in one way, and we thought that maybe the world and also the policies in the European Union should follow one guideline. Then arrived the war in Ukraine. And so we understood, and also the Commission just shifted the position to more security, energy, activity, and not mostly in changing the way from consuming fossils all around Europe. So also this kind of things, this kind of activities changes the way you do lobby in Europe. But most of the time, the differences between European lobbying, it's between these two kind of verticals. You have the impact of the regulation. Maybe a regulation is already on basis, and there's a will and a proposal of the Commission or of the Parliament to change this regulation. So we have clients that have to face this kind of will, maybe for stopping this kind of change, or maybe avoiding a change of a regulation that would be worse for this a sector of the industry, or maybe you don't have a regulation at all. So there's a new regulation coming, and so there's a new market arise in the European market. So the European Commission and the Parliament starts to talk about it and wants to shape regulation and do regulation about that. So we can intervene in saying what are our ideas, our positions in the market, positions about a new regulations coming. Another vertical, it's an activity that's more likely a brand awareness, because as you were saying, the most important activity between a lobbyist and a decision maker is about sharing information. Because a policymaker is not a guy that can rule the world and knows everything about the markets on which he wants or she wants to shape on. They need information, and information they can take it from the market. Obviously, we have an ethical code that we should always say the truth about the numbers and the things about the market. We can provide solutions. We can provide ideas how to shape a market, how to shape regulation, but always standing on points and on facts and on data that should be trustable, affordable, and measurable from the policymakers. Otherwise, we will not do in a very good way our job. We will do anything, we will do something else. And so sharing information is the basis between the relation between policymakers and lobbyists. Then we have two different kind of approach that we have between with them. If we have to engage a commissioner or people coming from some DG, we know that we are talking with bureaucrats. So they are not responsive to political behaviors, to political activities in their state country or whatever. They respond to Brussels, they respond to the Commission, they respond to the treaties and the rules based in Brussels and also in the Commission. So we will have a behavior most strictly sent to the points, to the facts, to data that allow us to better shape a policy on which we are engaged on. When we have to face or engage MPs, it's a little bit different because you're talking to politicians, you're talking to people that are elected in their constituencies. So we have to understand the interests of that, politicians or that delegation, or that it could be a delegation of a party that could have a position in some issues, or the delegation as a country as a whole. So we have to manage this as an interest of a specific country. Because obviously it changed the way you approach the decision maker. Because if you are an elected MPs, so you have to respond to the constituency, we have to respond to a party, you have to respond also to an interest of the state members, changes your perspective and also your interests and how you can manage an issue, or you want to bring on a policy making activity. One more thing, as I was saying, access to people, access to places, access to acts, rules that you have to follow. Maybe in Europe, we have a problem referring to some organizations that are not inside the regulatory framework of EU laws. And I'm referring sometimes some NGOs are working in Europe. We heard about the scandal of the Qatargate and whatever. I'm just not referring to them, but the fact that everybody in Europe is doing lobbying, except of the MPs and of the bureaucrats. But all the agencies, all the corporations, all the NGOs are trying to pursue an interest. It could be a general interest or a legitimate interest of a private single market. We should have rules based for everybody that should be the same, because we have, as I was saying, we are obliged to say for which clients we are working, how much money they gave us, for which issue or dossier we are working on, why we are engaging and meeting some MPs inside the parliament. And so we have to refer to the European Parliament all these activities. This should be done to everybody, to all the organization that has a point of contact with the EU institution, for having more transparency for all. And this could be a good benefit for European institutions, for our democracy. One last thing, as the European elections approach, it's always a time when where there is uncertainty. It's always a good time for lobbies to make money. But for one reason, because uncertainty creates a world where also the corporation doesn't know where to invest or where not to invest, because they are thrilled to understand which will be the future and the regulatory framework they will work on. So in this kind of period, especially during the elections, example in Italy, we have often in years. So it's better for us when there are elections in Italy because it's always a turnaround. But in Europe, every 5 years, in this kind of period, for us, it's a good time for having approach with clients, corporations, trade association, because they don't know what is going to happen in the next years. How which would be the new commissions, with the new commissioner in which kind of position, if Italy is asking for agriculture or for another kind of commissioners, if Germany or France, another one. So it's a particular period where we can, rise in terms of contracts or in terms of activity. Also, if the legislative period is ended, it's closed, it's finished. So we will not have any kind of legislative activity till the new commission is going to be established. So we're talking about November. So in this 6 months of period, despite the fact the European Parliament is not working, the Commission is not working, we are gaining contracts because corporations needs to understand, needs to have analysis and position paper on which will be the composition of the European Parliament, the majority, the commissioners, and whatever. So I finished, I quit, so I can leave the floor to Alberto for his speech. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Ernesto, for sharing these insights also from your own lobbying perspective. Now, welcome. We introduced you already earlier, Alberto, but and we go by first name. But thank you so much for joining us. So maybe you would also like to give your perspective from your experience as a researcher, but also in your activities in the Good Lobby. The floor is yours. And then Nell.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. Hello, everyone, and apologies for showing up late. I don't necessarily have a speech. I could talk about several aspects of the lobbying phenomenon, but perhaps I'm going to start by saying that my own take over the years, both as a scholar and as a public interest actor in this space, has been that lobbying is oftentimes misunderstood in our society. Lobbying should be seen as a legitimate form of participation in our society that exists beyond election, in the space existing in between election, whose major rationale is to provide information to decision makers so as to optimize decision making. That's where I come from. But what is the role that lobbying and interest group representation has been playing in Europe? I think is important to contextualize that for the purposes of our conversation today and also for Nilanjana's research work. It's important to remember that historically the European institutions and decision makers have been particularly open to third-party input. Since the early 50s, when the European Policy Community, the European Community were established, a practice of public consultation has been established. In other words, institutionalization of third-party input getting into decision-making occur very early, and certainly in different conditions than in the average member state of the European Union. That's where lobbying in the European Union comes from, with one specific rationale, which was extremely instrumental and epistemic. The decision maker could not know as well as the industry that was meant to regulate, and therefore it had to be on the listening side of things. And the technocratic nature of European decision-making, in which there is a supranational entity called European Commission that is doing the pre-legislative work based on political priorities coming from the member states of the Union and not from parliaments, has clearly created the conditions for this unique setting, which was inevitably rewarding special interest as opposed to diffuse interest. And this is the story of interest representation in the European Union, with a David and Goliath battle in which special interests do have access because the decision makers have a huge interest, which is very much linked to their own mission, vis-a-vis diffuse interests like public health, environment, or climate action these days, in which see the participation of civil society organization less significant. If you fast forward over time, you get the integrity report by Transparency International telling you that 75% of the meetings taking place in Brussels are meetings between European decision makers on the one side and special interest industry representatives on the other, with only 25% of the remaining meetings having to do with other kind of interest, ranging from student association to non-profit organizations and trade unions. Those are the realities of lobbying. However, at the end of the 90s, the time of the white paper on governance, when the European Union realized that he had to do something to change also its own constitutional setting and its own practices of listening, there's been an attempt at shifting the unique rationale of public consultation and listening from the technocratic and epistemic one towards a more participatory one, and saying we are not here only to gather information and data when we take decisions, but we're also here to give a chance to everyone on paper to actually show up and tell us what kind of expectations they might have vis-a-vis a particular policy file, and how prospectively we can identify what is going to happen if this policy option is going to be adopted. So the impact assessment revolution in the early 2002, was also meant to be an opening towards civil society organizations. And I don't think I'm too far from reality when I say that this participatory goal hasn't necessarily been achieved, in the sense that the reality of public participation in Europe hasn't necessarily changed as a result. And some might even argue that it has even worsened, because plain speaking has been set aside, the level of literacy required to take part to an average public consultation has increased, and therefore the barriers to access to policymakers have become even more complex to overcome. It is against this backdrop that I think the current debate about how to regulate special interest representation, but more in general lobbying, is currently developing, all the more so in the aftermath of the Qatar Gate. We basically realized already 10 years ago that the European Union had on paper one of the best, if not the best, regulatory framework to govern the relationship between decision maker and special interest. The OECD scored the European Union well above the average. The same did the European Court of Auditors. But then Qatar Gate occurred. And we realized that in reality, the integrity and ethics code applicable to the three institutions, the three main institutions, are not the same. And there was one institution, notably the European Parliament, that for a variety of reasons that I will briefly mention, was clearly suboptimal. It was not necessarily matching the best practices existing in other virtuous countries of jurisdiction. In other words, the European Union has been, over time, most of the time as a byproduct of the scandal of the day, established since the early 2000s some specific codes of conduct, but mainly at the European Commission level. But it hasn't necessarily been doing the same at the European Parliament level. And this has inevitably engendered some forms of impunity that has allowed certain forms of special interest representation to basically take a slippery slope into go into corruption. So we are no longer talking about lobbying, but we are still talking about attempts at influencing the decision makers, who do not seem to be protected by the system itself. The major reason why European officials working for the European Commission have to disclose their meetings, have to abide by a set of ethical rules, subjecting them to discretion, confidentiality, and other ethical rules, really has to do with these codes of conduct that were established. But those have not been extended by the members of the European Parliament. The major reason why the Parliament has been resisted, and still resists today, 2 years after the Qatar Gate, to the possibility of subjecting itself to the very same obligation, has to do with the interpretation we give to the role electeds have in our society. And in particular, the interpretation of the principle of freedom of electoral mandate, this idea that an elected official should be allowed to meet anyone without necessarily reporting about this because this is part of his job description, but it's also the only way she or he can actually make up his mind or her mind before taking a decision. Is still very much dominant in our understanding of the role parliaments do play. And therefore, this has been leading to a very thin set of ethical duties applicable to members of parliament who are allowed to engage into side activities during their mandate. Approximately 1/4 of the European Parliament members today have side jobs, and to be able to shift to a private sector job, to a public sector job that might lead to some possible conflict of interest at the very end of their parliamentary mandate. So 24 hours after leaving the European Parliament, all these MEPs on the job market, and they're able to monetize and therefore selling access to decision makers, and therefore fueling an industry that is growing over time. Those are the realities, I would say, of special interest representation in the European Union today, with a major complacent approach, I would say, by the dominant political class that keeps saying, both on the right and on the left, that the European voters are going to be forgetting about the Qatar, or they already forgotten about the Qatar Gate, and therefore this is going to fade away. I belong to those who rather argues that this Qatar Gate and scandals has profoundly damaged the perception the European institutions do have vis-a-vis the average citizens. When you look at the Eurobarometers, the last one that appeared a few months after the Qatar Gate and the last one, you can clearly see that this primacy of trust that the European institution enjoy vis-a-vis citizens as opposed to the national authorities is eroding. The average citizen still believe or trust more the European institution than the national ones, but this margin is decreasing, and potentially Qatar Gate might be one of the explanatory factor. We don't necessarily know whether this is the case or not. This is my impression, and I think the turnout in the next European June elections is going to probably tell us whether this supposition is true or not. It's a big question mark, right? Who is going to show up in 2024? Not only because of the way in which citizens' participation or special interest participation might occur, but there are also many other variables, of course. But it's important to, I think, flag this issue. So in essence, the European Union remains a wonderful laboratory to study interest representation. Is a wonderful laboratory to see how a transnational democracy can or should regulate interest representation. How can it get it right? How it can go beyond the scandal of the day in order to reform itself and to be slightly more ambitious. I'm going to conclude by saying that over time, the main rationale or driver behind lobbying regulation has been anti-corruption. So we are going to shed light on the relationship between decision makers and third parties because we want to be transparent. We want to avoid any form of possible corruption or abuse of power by those particular actors. However, we should shift away from this very narrow understanding of why we are regulating lobbying today towards a broader understanding of lobbying as a form of civic participation in which governments are trying to achieve yet another goal, which is participation. And if we do this, the very nature of the regulatory intervention will vary considerably because the institutions will no longer content themselves by saying everybody can show up and take part to a constitution. Anybody can send a letter to an MEP and have a meeting, to a system in which there will be a procedural duty on the very same public institutions to create the conditions of substantive equality in front of the law. And therefore, the institutions themselves should actually create the conditions so that everyone, all kinds of interests, might have the same opportunities to get there. I see many companies, progressive companies, going there, realizing that not only they have to become greener and social, but they also have to take care of their political footprint and therefore exercise their political pressure within both planetary boundaries and also democratic scrutiny. And this is what is clearly happening in the US in the terms of political donations, but is happening more and more in Europe with ESG data providers exercising a lot of scrutiny on how corporate political power is exercised today. So I see
Alberto,
more and more
sorry
companies going there. Yes, I'm
sorry
wrapping up.
to interrupt you. That was fascinating and super helpful. Since we are a little bit out of time, my proposal is the following. I know that both Catherine and Ernesto they are supposed to be in another meeting right now. So if you agree, I can take care of Q&A for Nel and Alberto. I just leave the floor one moment to Catherine if she wants to say something, and also Ernesto, he has to go. There is a question for him, but I don't know if he can answer. It's about ethical code on lobbying, but I know they are both super busy, so maybe you can reach him afterwards if you are interested in that. Catherine, if you want to say something.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. I unfortunately have to go to another meeting, but I think also both Ernesto's points on the kind of reality on the floor and what it also means, especially also what it's going to mean with the new election coming up. And then I think Alberto's, that's my own personal also interest in terms of how voters and how legitimacy is affected by lobbying aspects or aspects where lobbying goes away in the kind of Qatargate example that Alberto highlights are really important and important. Another area that Nell could kind of expand her research on. So it was really great, and thank you so much. And I hope that we're going to see each other again soon. And for Nell, I posted the book that I think could be also interesting to think about the regulatory aspect in the chat.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
You're welcome.
Okay, Ernesto, if you want to, you have the last chance before going.
Thank you everybody for this time, for sharing with me also, Anja, the research that as I talked to Stefano, I felt very strict to the point, and makes an instant of the reality of in Brussels right now. So for any comments or questions, I shared my email in the chat. I have to leave because I have another meeting.
Yes, I will be following up with you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ciao Alberto. I hope to see you soon here in Rome, and ciao Stefano.
Okay, thank you again, Ernesto.
Bye-bye.
And we just would like we can take like 10-15 minutes for a couple of Q&A, more maybe focused to the to Neil and Jenna's work or to what Alberto told us, which was particularly interesting because he made very clear that regulation is not always the result of fully rational process, very thoughtful, but I mean it's a product of history of scandals, of wave of public interest for a topic, which is I think is very useful reminder. Okay, we can you can write your question in the chat, or you can raise your digital hand if you want to make a comment, and we will try, if Teams allow us, to give you the floor. Just ask you to be brief if you want to add something. So maybe in the meanwhile that you think what to say, I take the opportunity to ask a question to Nell. Were you surprised that, I mean, if I understood correctly, Ernesto is not with us anymore, but he might be very happy of the result of your papers because you proved that it's a good investment to hire a lobbying firm. And the second question is related to the point you were kind enough to mention before, that do you think that there might be a sequence that at the first moment you lobby to shape the regulation, and the second moment you lobby to get the contract consistent with the regulation you shaped?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I guess we were surprised by finding any result at all, because as academics, we wanted to understand what is exactly happening in these meetings and how do they really affect the contracts. And I think the reality, as Ernesto said, it's more about building relationships. So if you think about it in that regard, having any sort of relationship is probably better than having none. Even if it doesn't give you specific information in improving your bid for the contracts, perhaps all that matters is that a regulator has seen your name before, and this breeds some kind of familiarity. So I guess we were thinking about it much more about what is the value of that information rather than the trade-off between having some face time and having no face time. I still can't say that I had a prior of what size of effects we would have found, and we need to do more work to make sure this result is airtight. But if that is the size of the effect, it's quite large.
Yeah, that's
And
super
then
large.
it begs the question of why more firms are not lobbying.
There is a very famous paper about American politics, and the title, I think it sounds like Why There Is So Few Money in American Politics.
Exactly.
And
Right. So this is consistent with much of that research.
okay.
And then your second question, I've forgotten already.
No, my second question was simply, but you probably already answered. If you think that companies first lobby to shape the
Yes.
regulation, and secondly, they lobby to get the contract that was the
So
producer.
maybe we can actually throw this question to Alberto, because I was going to ask Ernesto exactly this, because one of the assumptions in our model, so I'm happy to see that our baseline expectation that this is about an exchange of information because between regulators and firms is largely consistent with the experience of the people in the room who actually know a lot about the topic. Our assumption is that firms are seeking these meetings. But I don't know how the nature of that relationship evolves. So I was going to actually ask Ernesto to shed more light on this, but perhaps Alberto, who also knows a lot on this topic, and thanks again from the part of Ellie, my co-author, who you've already met with several times. You can maybe answer this question better than me.
Yeah, maybe we can ask Alberto to answer also to the point that Olivier Herdman and others made in the chat. That was actually a question for Ernesto, but maybe Alberto can answer this. Is it fair that is it okay that the tobacco industry and other the bad guys are allowed to lobby, and what do they expect when they try to lobby commissioner and others to basically I know how to say it in a polite way, but basically to have the right to kill us and making a ton of billions of profits in the process. The question was more articulated, saying that the UN rules oblige governments to protect decision making from tobacco industry influence. So if the UN has this expectation, why the tobacco industry is allowed to lobby? And the second question by, I don't see the name, by Rachele Cavara is for Nell, and she's asking to make clear the origin of the data, where they do come from. Alberto.
Yes. Let me start by saying that the tobacco industry represents a bit of an outlier in the sense that it was really testing the limits of what legitimate lobbying is about, to the point that in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, so the first international health instrument ever adopted, ratified by virtually all countries in the world, there is a provision that for the first time ever establishes an irreconcilable conflict between the activity of legislative making and the tobacco industry interventions. So de facto, we have a ban of lobbying on the tobacco industry on the legislative activity. This Article 5.3 that I've been studying over time is fascinating, but is also very tricky to implement. There are guidelines suggesting how this should happen, but there are very different interpretations. How easy it is to draw a line between what is legislative and what is not legislative? If there's a parliamentary committee happening, well, this is legislative. If the very same members of that parliamentary committee are in the European Parliament having a conference, should the PMI or the British American Tobacco be in that room? And I found myself in a lot of situations in which their presence was contested, also outside of the legislative framework. What is interesting is this Framework Convention on Tobacco Control set up a precedent that now many organizations in civil society would like to extend to other industries, which have very different nature, like fossil fuels, agro-food business, baby formulas for meals, and there's an ongoing debate. So over the past 5 years at the Summer Academy, I organize every year in Spain, we have always a panel discussing what are the pros and cons of this prohibition and what are the realities of implementation. Having said so, the European Commission in particular, has never been able to prove abidance to the framework, meaning that the members of the parliament, the members of the commission, their secretariats, they keep talking to the industry in the same way as before the Framework of Action Convention on Tobacco Control. So there's clearly an issue. The ombudsman opened an investigation. It set recommendations saying, hey, commission, you should take this more seriously. And I think she clearly has a point. On the second question, which is as complex as the first one, possibly even more complex, let me say briefly, by looking at the PowerPoint that you share with us, that I'm not too surprised to see that lobbying works. That's the reason why investment into corporate political activities continue to grow, not only across OECD countries, but also elsewhere. This is happening for a variety of reasons, which I think are worth unpacking. But one in particular, the fact that today there's more noise than ever around decision making. So those special interests, those groups who manage to get access to decision makers, they manage to get some signals as opposed to simply noise around decision makers by creating a privileged relationship, which is not only data driven, is also somehow personal. And this is becoming more and more prevalent in the new practices of lobbying when you think about micro-targeting of decision makers happening digitally. All these things are happening. And of course, they are costly. They are much more sophisticated than just having meetings. And then finally, point, which I think is important, I already mentioned to Eli, your colleague, your co-author, is that lobbying is not a monolith. There are so many subtler forms of influence that corporate political power is using, ranging from supporting a think tank to enlarging the number of trade association is a member of, or academic lobbying, the fact that you are creating a pool of researchers that are somehow playing the game by pushing for policy option B versus policy option A on rational arguments without necessarily saying they're doing so, are all lobbying phenomena that today escape entirely our attention, both on non-market strategy scholars like you and public policy scholars like me, who don't necessarily see this, because this is so far, and the lobbying regulation is not looking into these subtle forms of regulation, but corporations are going there. So if I have to make a prediction, the cost and the investment into lobbying spending is going to grow inevitably, because we're going to be shedding more light on corporate individual behavior, but the real activities will be outsourced to trade association, the real lobbyists today, and direct lobbying, and many other actors, agencies, and even foundations, philanthropies, they're also entering into the picture. And this would be very confusing for policymakers to understand and for scholars to unpack.
That's interesting. That's fascinating. And that lets us to Nell's final comment on the origin of her data, which directly relates to Alberto's comment on the difficulty to track all the lobbying activities in all its different forms.
So I don't actually look forward to the phenomenon getting even more complicated. But what I take from your comments, Alberto, is that our results might actually represent a lower bound, both on the side of participation, because we're not capturing these informal, subtle forms of participation, and potentially the extent of the benefits, which is good in the sense that we want to be conservative about our estimates. But then, yes, it also begs the question, why isn't there more money in lobbying? So Raquel, to answer your question, firstly, I'm happy to, send you the sources offline if you email me. But essentially, the EU has made a meetings database publicly accessible where all EU regulators need to disclose the meetings that they take. So the burden of disclosure is on the regulator, not on the firm or the special interest group or the association. And this is why we assume that the disclosure rate is quite high. There's other databases that where firms voluntarily disclose financial investments and things like that, but this is not something that's required across the board. So the most reliable source of meetings with EU regulators is this meetings database that's made public by the European Commission and the Parliament. And then in terms of the firm level data, we use a database called Orbis, which is one of the many databases provided by Bureau van Dijk. If you are a student or a member of the faculty at Bocconi, you have access to this database. It is quite annoying to use. I choose my words carefully because we're being recorded, but it is the best source of data for firms across Europe. And then the electronic database for the tenders for public procurement contracts, this is also maintained by a EU source, and it lists all public procurement contracts that are above a threshold value. And again, this is publicly available data.
Okay. Thank you for this clarification. I think we are out of time, but it was worth to take some additional minutes. I really thank Nell for her work and for this great presentation, and Catherine and Ernesto, and especially Alberto, who, despite all the difficulties, he made to be with us, and I think his contribution was extremely valuable. And I hope that this discussion will. This is just the beginning, and we will follow Nell's project, also because it's a great opportunity to discuss this very important topic and this aspect of European democracy and policy making. Let me just to conclude to remind you that our next webinar is on Monday, and it's another fascinating topic is the geopolitical impact of the global minimum tax. I think this title is great. I'm looking forward. It's not mine. I mean, it's Carlo Garbardino who is supervising this webinar, and I think this will be another interesting opportunity for a very policy making oriented chat to have together. Thank you all, and see you next time.
Thank you so much, Stefano, and the rest of the IEP staff. And again, let me thank you, Alberto, amongst your many busy commitments, for making the time to be here. We much appreciate it. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Well, first of all, let me thank the organizers, so Professor Giorgio Sacerdoti and Professor Leonardo Borlini, for having putting up this very timely and very much needed conference with so many great experts. And I have basically two questions. The first one concerns the dispute settlement mechanism reform. By Professor Hong, we received a very complete overview of the dynamics that the crisis and the suggestions to improve the system have known in these last years. So I wonder, what is your opinion about the use of the MPIA, so the multi-party interim arbitration arrangements in this period, interim period, of blurring situation, procedural situation, and whether you foresee or you know that non-MPIA parties think to use a similar instrument to the MPIA to have a sort of appeal in this current state of the blockage of the appellate body. So this is the first question. And the second question concerns the dispute settlement mechanism in the plurilateral trade agreements. So we know that the European Union, maybe Professor Goldman can step in this. We know that the European Union tried to show the way in which the international rule of law could be promoted also through this regional dispute settlement mechanism. But then after some initial efforts, it seems that now everything is quiet. So I wonder whether what are your thoughts, your ideas about this, whether you have a comparative perspective with what the United States are doing in their plurilateral preferential trade agreements, and what do you think about the instrument of the single entry point, that involves civil society in order to enforce sustainability issues promoted at bilateral, multilateral, also at unilateral level by the European Union? Sorry for being so long.
Thank you, Elisa Baroncini. We have another question in the chat. I cannot try to have the right pronunciation, but Onur Gakdar Arantas is a question about CBAM to Professor Goldman. How do you think the proceeds from the CBAM will be spent? On intra-EU sustainability or extra-EU developmental aid? I just remind you that we had a seminar on this with YEP. You can find a very interesting piece by an Indian economist, Partha Sen, on our website that we can share, where he exactly points to this issue that we are not helping the global south to comply with the environmental requirements that we are creating. Okay, is there someone else with the raising hands so that we can collect a couple of other questions and then we go back to the speakers? Leonardo, obviously you can take the floor. But you're mute. Okay,
yeah,
now we can
thank
hear
you very much. I have a couple of questions myself, one to Professor Matsushita, one to Professor Goldman. To Professor Matsushita, if you can hear me, I actually would like him to not elaborate, but just probably restate, because we had some interference with the audio, about the practical ways he suggested to overcome the issues that the new export controls are determining. And about for Professor Goldman, I was extremely fascinated by his presentation, also because I share many of his concerns regarding a certain inconsistency of the European declared trade policy right now. I just was, and that's very brief, I'm wondering, because this is my stance, but I don't know whether he's correct or is along his own perspective, whether the inconsistency of the European trade policy is also determined to some extent to a reactive stance that the European Union and the European Commission particularly are having right now. And I'm referring specifically to the different instruments or defensive instruments that the European Commission has either achieved to have in form of proper legislation, or has put now forward in 2024 package regarding, these are many, you mentioned some, we mentioned others. Problem is that for obvious reason of time constraints, we cannot really go into the detail of the entire package, but many of these packages are, to me, many of these pieces to me resemble those that the United States have already adopted. So my concern about the reactive stance is pretty much about that, and how these determine the possible, or actually what I agree is a very inconsistent or somehow an inconsistent framework, general framework of the policy of the Commission. Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe we can, I don't see anybody else, so maybe we can go back to the speakers, maybe starting with Professor Goldman.
Thank you very much for many questions. Professor Sacerdoti, allow me to come back to your mention of, or to your reaction on my admittedly provocative and probably polemical presentation. Of course, the EU is pursuing public interests in its own policies, but the main point, maybe that's how I should drive it home, the main point is they want to respect public policies on their own terms. And I think this, the Due Diligence Act that you mentioned is a wonderful example for that, because of course it is intended to protect public interests, but by the terms the EU is defining and imposing on its companies. And if you look at, or if you listen to, people from non-EU countries that are affected by that, what you can hear quite often is, why don't you let us do that? Or why don't we do it in an international fashion? Why do you have to do it unilaterally? Also considering that by now we have got different such laws that are in force already, so it's quite a burden on us, and we don't really know what we where we should look at. Not that the standards are totally different. The standards are normally international standards, ILO standards, and so on. But the reporting duties are quite different, and so that is what I mean exactly. They want to preserve public interests, but on their own terms, and as a consequence of that, someone else was saying, hey, I have a public interest here, I want to be protected, is being shamed as a protectionist. And that is not a good way of dealing with it. And Elisa Baroncini, you mentioned many important things. Is the EU still this promoter of international law if we look at trade? Well, I'm not so sure if trade is really the best way of looking at it. Well, in the 1990s, you probably could get away with an EU attitude. But let me recall that, as you all know, the EU has always been cautious not to give direct effect to trade rules in its internal legal order, at least for the purposes of damages. So it always has approached the rule of law in trade relations with, I would say, a political emergency valve integrated in it. And I don't think that this has fundamentally changed, but the problem is that the EU is now weaker to enforce such an approach and get away with it. The single entry point, I think, is a very good thing. I mean, it really streamlines things a lot and also allows the EU to be more efficient. And I think, in terms of shrinking EU powers, this is really to be welcomed. I have nothing that I could oppose to that. And maybe if the EU goes back to that, to more respect for the international trade order, it would also be helpful. But I don't really see the EU as a big defender of international trade. If you just look at some of the judgments of the ECJ or the General Court on trade defense measures, they are very often super perfunctory in their analysis of the international trade law, and that alone is already a problem. So again, you have got this internal external difference in the EU, which is kind of pervasive. I mean, it really ties in with this idea of EU legal autonomy that the European Court of Justice has advanced for since times immemorial, or since a couple of decades. And it really means that we make our own rules internally, and what we do externally is a different thing. Which brings me already to Leonardo's point. Yeah, I should probably include the 2024 package, and I agree with you that it is reactive in many respects. It's interesting that they're including security now in the title, economic security. So that really shows how defensive it is and how much they're trying to catch up with the others. But again, you know, that should be a reason to recall to the EU that now in the 2020s, it is more a recipient of trade rules than a maker of them. And that should make you recalibrate or you know, sort out your priorities differently. Do you really want to go into a big fight with India on almost any issue if you are already in a defensive position? Maybe not. It's just my opinion. I don't think that in the long term it's a brilliant strategy. So much on that.
I completely agree on that. So it's not.
Isn't India also in a defensive position? If I may intervene, and also other developing countries, they tend to defend somehow similarly their own position and don't engage in, I don't know, in having an international stockpiling for emergency of products. They think at their rice produce and their rice holding. There was a clash between India and Thailand at MC13 because Thailand objected to the policy of India. If you was also in the newspaper. So I see a shift to unilateralism by all sorts of countries, not to speak, of course, of the US. Sorry, then who has to... A question was for Professor Matsushita, I think, by Professor Bollini.
And then there was also I guess there were two questions for Professor Honjao by Professor Baroncini. And I added a question to Professor Honjao in the
Well,
chat.
let's start with Mitsuo. Mitsuo, are you there?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear? Yeah. Thank you, Professor Bollini, for your the question and comment. You speak about the importance of a practical way to resolve the conflict issues. That is prior notification and consultation. Now, I'd like to speak a little bit about the experience in the area of competition law, where this was a very important issue in the past. So of course, we are not today discussing a competition law issue, but this as far as extraterritoriality is concerned, this question is, I think, is relevant. Now, in 1964, there was the ILA conference, International Law Association Conference in Tokyo, where the extraterritorial application of the competition law was one of the major issues. And I was at the time the graduate student and attended the conference. And then in that time, the United States was the only country where the extraterritorial application was made. And the delegates from European countries they criticized the U.S. practice by saying that this is the over-expansion of the national jurisdiction and so forth and so on. And strict territorial principles should be established. So that was the whole tone of the conference. Now, in 1968, about 4 years later, there was another conference of ILA. That's in New York, I believe. And I didn't attend that conference, but I read the report of it. And then the situation is very different because between 1964 and 1968, the EEC, the predecessor of the EU, started extraterritorial application, and so that drastically changed the scene. then the emphasis is to recognize the extraterritorial application and how to put a limit to it. So I think this shows that issues like this is a legal issue, but I think in essence it is close to political issue. And so so what happens later is that the IAEA and other international bodies and so on try to establish some kind of principle of international law with regard to the jurisdiction. But in fact, all of them didn't work so well. And eventually, they came up with the practical solution. That was the prior consultation and also prior notification of consultation, and if possible, the convergence of the domestic laws. Those three things should be more emphasized than just discussing abstract principles. And so nowadays, in the area of constitutional law, there is very little conflict of jurisdiction because harmonization has been achieved to a large extent. And then the OECD and also ICN, International Competition Network, those two have been instrumental in bringing the countries together in prior consultation and the prior notification and consultation. And that de facto resolved the most of the issues in that area. So I think that we can learn something from that experience and apply it to the area of export control. Of course, export control is more political than competition law, so we cannot probably introduce everything that happened in competition law area and bring it into the export control area. But I think we can learn that instead of rather than staying on the abstract principles, it is better to focus on some practical ways of resolving the issue. Well, this is the comment I have. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Matsushita. And now, if I can, Giorgio, I will let Professor Hongzhao to reply to the two questions that Professor Baroncini made. And if I might add, because I'm very interested in your opinion, I wrote a very brief question on the chat for you, and which was related to one of the points that Elisa made, meaning the possible role of dispute settlement mechanism in the so-called new generation free trade agreements. I just wonder whether, as a privileged observer and a renowned expert, you might tell us your perspective on that, and specifically, you might also share with us your view regarding the position of China in the possibility of creating or setting up dispute settlement mechanism at plurilateral or bilateral level in the free trade agreements that China is concluding or is negotiating. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Giorgio. If you allow me to respond directly to Leonardo's question. Well, it is quite interesting perspective, as you know, that China may be the most steadfast supporter, promoter of the multilateral trading system, and we hold multilateralism very close to the heart of the Chinese, and this is from a kind of a bottom-up, perspective of all the international trade circles. The enterprises and the trade officials and the high-ranking decision makers all hold closely to the multilateralism. China did participated, I think, a number of maybe 19 FTA, RTAs. Some of them consist a sort of dispute settlement. But I think nevertheless, there isn't a kind of very active application of those dispute settlement. And another dispute settlement mechanism China is a part of is the MPIA, the multi-party investment international dispute settlement. So as far as on the China's perspective, I think it is always that we believe a single two-tier binding international dispute settlement at the multilateralism at the World Trade Organization would be most desirable of all members of the WTO. But given the difficult situation, China may stay with the multi-party dispute settlement arbitration, the appeal arbitration approach of settling dispute among WTO members who are party to MPIA. But other than that, China is not, I guess it's less innovative. Maybe we should also learn from others and in thinking about other approaches in settling disputes. But China is also starting to have more cases under the ICSID convention. China don't have much cases due to various reasons, but recently we have a few cases. In particular, one we have the new generation of BITs, and China also. I think that there are cases rising under the investment treaty. So perhaps that may provide opportunity for international lawyers to be part of that process. I hope that is okay for you.
A very, very insightful perspective. Thank you very much. Also because we have many dispute settlement mechanisms on paper in many free trade agreements concluded by European Union, US, Australia, and very few working now, so operational. So there is this hiatus between the possibility of having already established on paper the mechanism and then having them functional. Thank you very much for this very insightful comment. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have still some more minutes. Does someone want to ask other questions or to write in the chat? I mean, we are still incredibly more or less on time. I think that Professor Goldman has to leave, so we really thank him very much.
Very sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Have
Thank
a good
you
day.
so much.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye bye.
We really enjoyed your provocative presentation. Thank you so much.
Stefano, I guess there were two questions for Professor Madame Hongzhao by Elisa Baroncini.
Oh yes. Elisa, maybe you want to recall the questions?
Question about
new generation free trade.
You know, that was my question. She made two questions at the very beginning, but then probably Matthias step in. Elisa, if you are still online.
Elisa, I think you are there. So if you want to
step
in.
Yes, okay. I step in. Basically, I was asking to Professor Hong what she thinks about the future possible use of the MPIA by the MPIA parties due to the fact that we don't have at the horizon appearing a significant shared reform process of the dispute settlement mechanism. So whether the MPIA parties will make a greater use of the MPIA and whether the non-PIA parties will be inspired by this interim mechanism to settle the dispute at a sort of appellate stage. So what is your opinion?
Oh, thanks very much for that question. I thought it's very a good question to respond. Actually, Marcos, who is a Brazilian lawyer, who participated the seminars of March 6, which I organized in PKU Law School. he raised the same question that what is the way to how to say to bring the United States back to a binding dispute settlement mechanism at World Trade Organization. And my approach, my answer to that question of him, at the end of the meeting is that I said, let's play, make a fair play at the NPIA. Make the NPIA, which is still alive, a good example of dispute settlement. To let the system without the participation of US, a big member, to be successful, because we want the system to be good, to be fair to every member, to have a due process, to have its own, integrities of its decisions, and setting up examples for all members, and that make that system more attractive. And they also set up, I think, be helpful in setting up confidences of members in dispute settlement. That is my answer to him. And I think, to me, for any international dispute settlement at any level, regional, plurilateral, or the multilateral, it is for the, it is for justice. It's for the fair result. To apply the law of that treaty correctly, to interpret the treaty in good faith, and to make a fair decision for all parties. When the party come into before a court or a judicial body, they want to have a fair outcome. They want the rules to be played fairly. They want to have a trust of the organization. But then the organization needs to establish its own credibility by each of its interpretations and each of its decisions. That is the fair play of the system that bring back people back and bring the confidence, setting up the confidence of all participants to that process. There's nothing else, I think. So that's my answer to these questions, and I do believe all the former members of the appellate body, I think they hold closely the integrity and the independence and impartiality at their heart, and in every of the cases, and the composition of the representative of different regions of the world in that appellate body is in itself a check and balances for making sure that decision could be more or less fair and justiciable to the participants. I think that is the reason still the most majority of members trust and like to support the appellate body. But that members decide what would be the outcome. But recently I have a sense that quite it may not be so fair for telling the overreaching or the quite some number of concerns. The appellate body make 130 decisions, but you cannot focus on a few of them and a few matters. So roughly over the past 25 years, the appellate body did make good decisions, and they help members settle their dispute to the great extent. And I think, of course, there are groans and misgivings, and here and there, even China has its own, complaints. The EU and the US, they all have different, complaints on some of the cases. But overall, in general, I think appellate body and the World Trade Organization dispute settlement mechanism over the past 25 years did, I think, somehow did a fair job, and that could be witnessed by everyone. That is why the system still operates, though the appellate body is in limbo. But we hope member could resolve that matter. And next year would be the 30th anniversary of the World Trade Organization. Let's see what's going to happen at the end of the year, and hope that we will bring back the reactivated the operation of the pilot body or the review body at the second stage. Thank you. I hope that helped you.
A big thank you, Professor Ong. Very, very thoughtful and thought-provoking. Thank you so much.
Okay, so at this point, I take back my role of moderator. Stefano, are there any other questions pending?
I don't see so. I don't see anything unanswered.
So I thank the participants, especially Zhao and Mitsuo for it's already late today. And Leonardo will organize a second part at 2:30 European Central Time. And I say goodbye to everybody in the meantime. Leonardo, anything to it?
No, we are
Thank
joining
you.
at 2:15 for those who are interested, because we try to start a little bit earlier in order to be perfectly on time, because some of the speakers have time constraints. So 2:15 for those.
And I think Leonardo will be the moderator in the afternoon, right?
Sure.
Yes, no problem at all. I will be there. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you,
See you
Zhao.
later.
Nice to see you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.